What made you realize the family friend, who was always around, had been playing both sides the entire time? It was the text message I wasn't supposed to see. Dennis had been at every family gathering since I was 8. He'd been my dad's best friend since college, the guy who helped us move houses, who loaned my parents money when things were tight, who showed up to every one of my basketball games with a camcorder. Uncle Dennis, we called him, though there was no blood relation. When I turned 18, my parents started having money problems. Real ones. Not the kind where you skip vacation, but the kind where the bank sends foreclosure notices. Dennis was there immediately, offering to help restructure their loans, connect them with financial advisors he knew. My parents were so grateful. He'd drive over twice a week to go through paperwork with them at the kitchen table. That's when things got strange. My mom started having anxiety attacks. She'd lock herself in the bathroom and cry for hours. I'd sit outside the door listening to her sob, asking what was wrong. She'd just shake her head when she finally emerged, her eyes red and swollen, and say they were handling it. Meanwhile, Dennis kept showing up with solutions. He refinanced their mortgage through his connections, got my dad a job interview at a company he consulted for, even offered to pay for my college tuition if I stayed local instead of going to my dream school across the country. I thought he was being generous until I came home early from work one afternoon. Dennis's car was in the driveway, which wasn't unusual, but something felt off. The way it was parked, crooked and hurried like he'd been in a rush. I walked in quietly and heard voices from my dad's office. The door was cracked open just enough that I could see Dennis leaning against the desk, my dad sitting with his head in his hands. "You need to tell her the truth," Dennis was saying. "She's going to find out eventually." "I can't," my dad replied, his voice breaking in a way I'd never heard before. "Not after everything." "Then I will. This has gone on long enough." I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. When Dennis emerged, he looked startled to see me standing there, but then his expression shifted to something almost triumphant, something cold and satisfied. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed me his phone without saying a word. On the screen was a text thread between him and someone labeled as CR, my dad's brother. The messages went back months, Dennis detailing every conversation he had with my parents, their financial situation laid out in painful detail, their marriage problems, the fights they'd had when they thought I was asleep, even things I'd told him in confidence about my college plans, about the scholarship offers I'd received, about my dreams of studying engineering. He'd been feeding everything to my uncle, who'd been using the information to slowly buy up the properties and investments my parents were being forced to sell, at rock-bottom prices, through shell companies, so they'd never know who was really buying. But that wasn't even the worst part. Scrolling further, I found messages about the refinanced mortgage. Dennis had structured it so my parents would default within 18 months, guaranteeing the house would go to auction. My uncle already had the winning bid prepared. Dennis's fee for the whole operation? 15% of everything they acquired, plus the satisfaction of watching my dad lose everything after some decades-old grudge I'd never even heard about. I looked up at Dennis. He didn't seem ashamed, just annoyed at being caught, like this was an inconvenience rather than a betrayal. "Your father made his choices," he said calmly. "This is just business." That's when I heard footsteps behind me. My mom stood in the hallway, her face drained of all color. She'd heard everything. For a moment, nobody moved. The house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Then she walked past both of us into the office where my dad was still sitting, oblivious, going through the paperwork Dennis had brought him, the same paperwork designed to ruin him. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "All of us. Now." Dennis smiled, that same warm smile I'd seen at 1,000 family dinners, and sat down at the table like he owned the place. Like this was his house, and we were the guests. My dad looked up from the papers, confused. "What's going on?" I held up Dennis's phone, my hand shaking so badly the screen blurred. "How long have you known Uncle Charles was trying to destroy us?" The color drained from my dad's face. He glanced at Dennis, then at my mom, then back at me. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Finally, he managed, "I don't understand what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," I said. My voice came out harder than I intended, but I couldn't stop it. "Dennis has been feeding Uncle Charles every detail about our finances for months. Every conversation, every struggle, everything we've told him in confidence. He's been documenting our entire life and selling it to the highest bidder." My dad stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor, his eyes locked on Dennis. "Tell me that's not true." Dennis leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed. He crossed his legs and folded his hands in his lap like we were discussing the weather. "Your son has quite the imagination. I have your text messages right here. Hundreds of them. Those could be taken out of context." My mom's voice cut through the room like a knife. "Stop lying. I heard you in the hallway. I heard every single word you said. You told him to tell her the truth, that this has gone on long enough. So tell us the truth." The smile finally faded from Dennis's face. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then my dad sank back into his chair, his head in his hands, and I realized he was crying. I'd never seen my dad cry before. "Why?" he asked quietly. "After everything we've been through together, all those years, why would you do this?" Dennis's expression hardened. His jaw clenched and something flickered in his eyes, something dark and ancient. "You really don't know?" "Know what?" 26 years ago, you slept with my wife." The room went silent. My mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, all the air leaving my lungs at once. My dad looked up, his face pale as a ghost. "Melissa, that was one time. We were both drunk at your New Year's party. It meant nothing. You forgave me." "I lied," Dennis said flatly. I told you I forgave you because I wanted you to let your guard down. And you did. For over 2 decades, you've trusted me completely while I waited for the perfect moment to take everything from you. Every birthday party, every Thanksgiving dinner, every time I showed up with gifts for your son, I was planning this, documenting everything, building my case. That's insane, my mom said, her voice shaking. You threw away a friendship over something that happened before we were even married? Friendship? Dennis laughed, a cold sound that made my skin crawl. There was no friendship. There was just me, watching, waiting, and planning. Your husband took something precious from me. My marriage never recovered. Melissa left me 6 years later because she could never look at me the same way after confessing what happened. I lost the woman I loved because of him. My dad's voice was barely a whisper. You could have cut me off, moved on, built a new life. I did build a new life, Dennis said, standing up now, pacing the room like a lawyer making his closing argument. One dedicated to watching you suffer. Every dinner I sat through, listening to your boring stories. Every basketball game I attended, pretending to care whether your kid made a shot. Every time I pretended to care about your pathetic family, I was gathering information, learning your weaknesses, waiting for Charles to contact me, which he did 4 years ago after you screwed him over on that property deal in Michigan. I remembered that deal. My uncle had been furious, showing up at our house at midnight, screaming at my dad on the front lawn. They hadn't spoken since. So you teamed up with Uncle Charles to ruin us? I asked. Your uncle provided the capital and the shell companies. I provided the inside information and the means to execute. It's been beautiful, really. Watching your father scramble, watching your mother cry herself to sleep, watching this family fall apart piece by piece. And the best part? You never suspected a thing. You actually thought I cared about you. My mom stood up abruptly, her chair falling backwards and clattering against the floor. Get out of my house. Technically, Dennis said, pulling a folder from his briefcase, in about 4 months, this won't be your house anymore. The mortgage I restructured? It has a balloon payment due in November. Based on your current income and the debt I've helped you accumulate, there's no way you'll make it. The house will go to auction, and Charles already has the winning bid prepared at 60% of market value. You'll lose everything, and there's nothing you can do about it. My dad lunged across the table, but I caught his arm. He was shaking with rage, tears streaming down his face. Dennis didn't even flinch. He just smiled that same smile and stood up, straightening his tie like he was heading to a business meeting. I'll see myself out, he said, walking toward the door. Oh, and one more thing. That job interview I arranged for you, Thomas, the company's going to rescind the offer tomorrow morning. Turns out they did a more thorough background check and found some discrepancies in your resume from 1997. You lied about having a master's degree. You'll probably be fired from your current job too, once they find out. I made sure HR got an anonymous tip. He walked to the door, then paused, his hand on the doorknob. 26 years I've waited for this moment. 26 years of pretending to be your friend, your confidant, your brother. And you know what? It was worth every second. Enjoy the next 4 months. They're the last ones you'll spend in this house. The front door closed behind him with a soft click. None of us moved. My mom started crying, these horrible gasping sobs that shook her whole body. My dad sat frozen, staring at the papers spread across his desk like they were written in a foreign language. I stood there holding Dennis's phone, my mind racing through a decade of memories, trying to separate what was real from what was performance. Then I remembered something, the text messages. I started scrolling through them again, this time reading more carefully, looking for anything we could use. Dennis had been meticulous in documenting everything, which meant he'd been sloppy about covering his tracks. Every shell company, every transaction, every detail of the scheme was right there in black and white, preserved in digital ink. Dad, I said slowly, I need you to call your lawyer, right now. He looked up at me, his eyes hollow and red. There's no point. We can't afford to fight this. We don't have the money. We don't need to afford it. Dennis just handed us everything we need to prove fraud. These messages show he deliberately structured the mortgage to fail. That's illegal. Intentional sabotage of a financial contract. And the stuff about Uncle Charles using shell companies to hide his identity during property purchases, that's fraud too. Multiple counts. My mom wiped her eyes, smearing mascara across her cheeks. Are you sure? I'm not a lawyer, but I took business law last semester. Professor Mitchell spent an entire week on mortgage fraud cases. What they're doing is called conspiracy to commit fraud. If we report this to the authorities, they could both go to prison. For the first time that night, something like hope flickered across my dad's face. He picked up his phone with trembling hands and dialed his lawyer, a guy named Harold Brennan, who'd handled some minor legal stuff for us over the years. While my dad explained the situation, his voice cracking every few words, I kept scrolling through Dennis's messages. That's when I found something else. A message from 8 months ago where Dennis mentioned something about the Boston property. I clicked on the attachment. It was a scanned document showing that Uncle Charles had purchased a commercial building in Boston using money he'd borrowed from Dennis. The loan was structured so that if Charles defaulted, Dennis would own the property outright. No questions asked. I showed my mom. Her eyes widened as she read through the terms. That building is worth at least $8 million. If Charles defaults, Dennis gets everything. And based on these messages, I said, scrolling further through the conversation thread, Charles is about to default. He's been using our money to pay Dennis's loan, but once we're bankrupt, he won't have any more funds coming in. Dennis is going to destroy him too. My mom looked at me, understanding dawning on her face. You mean Dennis is planning to betray Charles too? It looks like it. Dennis isn't just getting revenge on Dad. He's using Uncle Charles as a tool, a weapon, And once we're destroyed, he's going to take everything from Charles too. This whole thing is bigger than just our family. My dad hung up the phone. His hands had stopped shaking. Harold's coming over first thing tomorrow morning at 7. He says if what you're describing is accurate, we have a strong case for fraud and conspiracy. He's also going to contact the FBI because this crosses state lines. Charles lives in Connecticut, Dennis operates out of New York, and we're here in Illinois. That makes it federal. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, listening to my parents' muffled voices through the walls. They were still up, going through paperwork, trying to figure out how deep the damage went. I kept thinking about all those years. All those birthdays where Dennis had brought me expensive presents. All those holidays where he'd sat at our table, eating my mom's cooking, laughing at my dad's jokes. All those graduations, basketball games, school events where he'd been there with his camcorder, documenting everything. Had he been documenting those moments out of love? Or had it just been part of his performance? Had any of it been real? I thought about the time I was 11 and broke my arm falling off my bike. Dennis had driven me to the hospital because my parents were both at work. He'd sat with me for 5 hours while they reset the bone, bought me ice cream afterwards, told me jokes to keep my mind off the pain. Had that been fake too? The worst part was knowing I'd never get answers to those questions. Even if Dennis confessed everything, even if he explained every moment of the last decade, I'd never know what was real and what was calculation. That's what betrayal does. It poisons every memory, makes you question everything you thought you knew. Harold arrived at 7 the next morning, exactly as promised. He was a short man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, carrying a briefcase that looked older than I was. He spent 6 hours going through Dennis's phone, taking screenshots of every message, making copies of every document, organizing everything into categories. By the afternoon, he'd contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and filed a formal complaint. An agent named Carla Hutchinson called us that evening. "This is extensive," she said over speakerphone. Her voice was crisp and professional. "If even half of what's in these messages is accurate, we're looking at wire fraud, conspiracy, mortgage fraud, and possibly racketeering under RICO statutes. I need you to bring the phone to our office tomorrow morning at 9. Don't delete anything. Don't send any messages from it. And whatever you do, don't tell Dennis or your brother that you've contacted us." "What happens next?" my dad asked. "We investigate. We'll subpoena financial records, interview witnesses, build a case. If the evidence supports criminal charges, we'll move forward with prosecution. In the meantime, I'm going to put a hold on the mortgage restructuring. The bank will be notified that the loan is under federal investigation, which should freeze any foreclosure proceedings until we can determine if fraud occurred." For the first time in months, my mom smiled. It was small and shaky, but it was there. The investigation took 9 weeks. During that time, Dennis called my dad 34 times. I counted. My dad ignored every call, following the FBI's instructions to maintain no contact. Uncle Charles called too, demanding to know why the mortgage payments had stopped, why his calls weren't being returned. My dad told him we'd decided to hire a lawyer and were reviewing our options. Charles hung up cursing. Meanwhile, Agent Hutchinson and her team were building their case. They subpoenaed Dennis's bank records, his business accounts, and all his communications with Uncle Charles. They interviewed the financial advisors Dennis had recommended to us, most of whom flipped immediately when they realized they were facing prison time. They discovered that the scheme had started even earlier than we thought. Dennis had been manipulating our finances for over 6 years, slowly steering my dad toward bad investments and away from good ones. Every financial advisor Dennis had recommended was someone in on the scheme, taking kickbacks to give my dad terrible advice. The refinanced mortgage was just the final trap, designed to guarantee our bankruptcy and make Uncle Charles rich. And the Boston property scheme confirmed what I'd suspected. Dennis had been planning to betray Uncle Charles all along, using our destruction as a way to drain Charles's resources and force him to default on the $8 million loan. On a Thursday morning in October, the FBI arrested both Dennis and Uncle Charles. They did it simultaneously, coordinated raids on both their homes at 6 in the morning. The charges included conspiracy to commit wire fraud, mortgage fraud, illegal financial manipulation, and racketeering. Dennis was also charged with breach of fiduciary duty and identity theft for creating fake credentials to pose as a legitimate financial advisor. The local news covered the story that evening. "Local businessman arrested in elaborate fraud scheme," the headline read. They showed footage of Dennis being let out of his office in handcuffs, looking smaller somehow, diminished. His expensive suit rumpled, his hair messy. I watched it with my parents, feeling nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, just a strange numbness, like watching a movie about someone else's life. The trial started 6 months later. Harold connected us with a victim's rights advocate named Patricia Chen, who helped us navigate the legal process. She was a small woman with kind eyes who'd been through something similar with her own family. She explained everything in detail, walked us through what to expect, prepared us for the hard parts. We had to testify about how Dennis had manipulated us, how he'd used our trust against us, how he'd documented every private conversation for his revenge scheme. I had to sit on the witness stand and recount every detail I could remember about Dennis's involvement in our family, every conversation, every moment that now seemed suspect. The defense attorney tried to make me look unreliable, questioning my memory, suggesting I was exaggerating Dennis's role, but the text messages spoke for themselves. Uncle Charles took a plea deal 3 days into the trial, admitting to his role in exchange for a reduced sentence. He gave up Dennis completely, providing emails, recorded phone calls, and financial documents that proved Dennis was the mastermind behind everything. In his testimony, Charles said Dennis had approached him 4 years earlier with a simple pitch. "I can destroy your brother, make us both rich, and all you have to do is provide the money and keep your mouth shut." Charles had jumped at the opportunity. The property deal in Michigan had cost him nearly $2 million, and he'd been waiting for a chance to get even. What he hadn't known was that Dennis was playing him too, slowly draining his accounts through fake investment opportunities and setting him up to lose the Boston property. Charles broke down crying on the stand, saying he'd been an idiot, that he'd let revenge blind him, that he'd destroyed his own family for nothing. Dennis refused to take a plea deal. He wanted his day in court, wanted to tell his story his way. During his testimony, he showed no remorse whatsoever. He sat in the witness box, calm and composed, and explained in meticulous detail how he'd planned everything, how he'd befriended us with the specific purpose of destroying us later, how every kind gesture had been calculated to make the betrayal more devastating. "I wanted Thomas to lose everything," Dennis said from the witness stand, looking directly at my dad. "His home, his job, his reputation, his family's security, his peace of mind. I wanted him to know what it feels like to watch something precious slip away because of someone else's actions. I wanted him to experience the same helplessness I felt when Melissa told me what happened, when my marriage dissolved because I couldn't look at her the same way anymore." The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Elizabeth Monroe, asked if he regretted anything about what he'd done. Dennis looked directly at my dad, holding his gaze for a long moment. "Only that I got caught before I could finish. I wanted to see him homeless. I wanted to see his family scattered. I wanted him to know that everything he'd built was destroyed because of one stupid mistake he made when he was drunk." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Dennis guilty on all 12 counts. The judge sentenced him to 18 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay full restitution for all the financial damages he'd caused, which totaled just over $2 million. Uncle Charles got 8 years and had to forfeit the Boston property, but that wasn't the end of it. The bank that held our mortgage sued Dennis's company for fraud. The case took another year to resolve, but eventually the restructured loan was nullified and our original mortgage terms were reinstated. We were behind on payments, but manageable behind, not disaster behind. My dad's company didn't fire him after the FBI explained that the resume discrepancy was part of Dennis's fraudulent scheme, fabricated evidence Dennis had planted to destroy his career. The Boston property? It was seized as part of Dennis's criminal assets and sold at auction by the federal government. The proceeds were split between his victims, which included us, 2 other families Dennis had defrauded in similar schemes, and several investors he'd scammed over the years. We received $340,000 as restitution. My parents used that money to catch up on the mortgage and repair their credit. They paid off their car loans, their credit cards, the medical bills that had been piling up, but they sold the house anyway. "Too many bad memories," my mom said. "Too many ghosts in those rooms." They bought a smaller place in the suburbs, a ranch-style house with a big backyard and windows that let in lots of light. My mom said she never wanted to feel trapped again. I ended up going to my dream school after all. The Victims' Rights Fund helped cover some of my tuition, and I got scholarships for the rest. I studied finance with a focus on fraud prevention. I wanted to make sure no one else got destroyed the way Dennis had tried to destroy us. I wanted to understand how people like him operate, how they think, how to spot them before they do damage. But here's the thing that haunts me. 3 years after Dennis went to prison, I got a letter from him. It was forwarded through the victim's advocate, Patricia, who gave me the choice whether to read it or not. She said some victims found closure in reading these letters, while others found them deeply upsetting. She said the choice was entirely mine, and there was no wrong answer. I almost threw it away. I stood in my apartment holding that envelope for 20 minutes, staring at Dennis's handwriting on the address label. Finally, I opened it. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten in careful script. In it, Dennis apologized. He said prison had given him time to reflect on what he'd done, how he'd let one betrayal consume his entire life. He said he'd been wrong to take his revenge so far, wrong to involve innocent people like me and my mom, wrong to spend decades nursing a grudge instead of moving forward. He said he'd started therapy in prison, something he should have done 26 years earlier. He said his therapist helped him understand that what he'd done to us was far worse than what my dad had done to him, that his response was disproportionate, cruel, and ultimately self-destructive. He said he understood if I never forgave him, that he didn't deserve forgiveness, but he wanted me to know that he was truly sorry for the pain he'd caused. He said he hoped I could forgive him someday, even though he didn't deserve it. I read that letter 5 times, trying to figure out if it was genuine or just another manipulation. Was this real remorse, or was Dennis still playing games, still trying to work an angle? I still don't know. I never wrote back, but I kept the letter. Sometimes I take it out and read it again, trying to understand how someone can be in your life for years, can know everything about you, can attend every important moment, and still see you as nothing more than a target. My dad never talks about Dennis. If someone mentions him, if the case comes up in conversation, my dad changes the subject immediately. My mom says he's processing it in his own way, but I think he's just broken. He trusted Dennis more than anyone except family, and that trust was weaponized against him. That kind of betrayal doesn't heal cleanly. It leaves scars that never quite fade. Last year, on my 22nd birthday, my dad pulled me aside after dinner. We were at their new house, the one with the big windows and the bright kitchen. My mom had made my favorite meal, lasagna with garlic bread, and we'd all been laughing about something silly. It was a good day, one of the first truly good days we'd had in years. "I need to tell you something," my dad said, leading me out to the back porch. About what happened with Dennis's wife. I held up my hand. You don't have to explain. That was between you and Dennis. It's ancient history. No, he said firmly. You deserve to know the truth. What Dennis said at the house that night and what he testified to in court about sleeping with Melissa, that wasn't exactly what happened. I looked at him. His hands were shaking as he gripped the porch railing. Melissa came on to me at that New Year's party. She was drunk, really drunk, and she was upset about something Dennis had done. They'd been fighting all night, I could tell. She cornered me in the kitchen and she kissed me. I kissed her back for maybe 10 seconds before I realized what was happening and pushed her away. I told her she needed to go sleep it off, that this was a mistake. The next morning, she told Dennis that I'd made a move on her. She was trying to make him jealous, trying to get a reaction because he'd been emotionally distant for months. She wanted him to fight for her. Did you tell Dennis the truth? I tried. Multiple times. He wouldn't listen. He wanted to believe his wife, so he did. She was crying. She seemed genuinely upset. And I was the outsider in their marriage. Even after their divorce, even after Melissa admitted to him years later that she'd lied about the details, that she'd initiated it, he never acknowledged it, because by then, the grudge had become his entire identity. He'd built his whole life around hating me, and he couldn't let that go without admitting he'd wasted decades on a lie. My dad looked at me, his eyes wet with tears. I'm telling you this because I don't want you to spend your life holding on to anger. What Dennis did was unforgivable, truly unforgivable. But if you let that poison your view of the world, if you start seeing betrayal everywhere and trusting no one, you'll end up just like him, angry, isolated, and empty. I don't want that for you. I thought about that conversation constantly over the next few months. About forgiveness, about moving forward, about whether some betrayals are too deep to recover from. I thought about the letter Dennis had sent me, still sitting in a drawer in my apartment bedroom. I thought about the 10 years he'd been in our lives, and whether any of those moments had been real. Then, last month, I got a call from Patricia, the victim's advocate. Dennis had died in prison. Heart attack. He was only 58 years old, which seemed impossibly young. She said it had been quick, that he hadn't suffered. She asked if I wanted any information about funeral arrangements. I said no. I felt something when I heard the news, but I still can't identify what it was. Not sadness, exactly. Not relief either. Just a strange emptiness, like the end of a story that never quite made sense. Like closing a book before you reach the last chapter. His daughter reached out to me through social media 2 days later. I didn't even know Dennis had a daughter. Her name was Sophie, and she was 29, just a few years older than me. She'd been estranged from him since she was 16, around the same time his marriage to Melissa fell apart. She sent me a long message explaining that she'd cut contact with her father after he became obsessed with revenge, after he stopped being a father and became something else entirely. She wanted to apologize on his behalf for everything he'd put our family through. She said he'd talked about us in his letters to her from prison, expressed genuine remorse for his actions, and wished he could undo the damage he'd caused. She said she'd visited him once in prison, about a year before he died, and he'd been a different person, smaller, quieter, genuinely regretful. My dad was sick, she wrote. Not physically, though I guess that caught up with him eventually, but mentally. He couldn't let go of anger. It destroyed his marriage, his relationship with me, his career, and eventually his freedom. I'm so sorry you had to experience that darkness. I know what it's like to be close to him and realize the person you thought you knew was just a mask. I wrote back thanking her. I told her that her father's actions weren't her responsibility, that she had nothing to apologize for. I told her about my own journey, about studying fraud prevention, about trying to understand how people like Dennis think. She wrote back saying she'd become a therapist, specializing in helping people process betrayal trauma. We ended up meeting for coffee a few weeks later. Sophie told me stories about growing up with Dennis that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. How he'd been warm and loving when she was young, but after the divorce, something fundamental had changed in him. How he'd started keeping detailed journals about people who'd wronged him, not just my dad, but neighbors, coworkers, anyone who'd slighted him. How he'd become obsessed with the concept of justice, of making sure people paid for their mistakes. How she tried to get him into therapy and he'd refused, insisting he was fine, that everyone else was the problem. I lost my father years before he went to prison, Sophie said, stirring her coffee absently. The man who raised me, who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework, he disappeared. And this angry, vengeful person took his place. It was like watching someone be possessed, except there was no exorcism, no way to bring him back. That night, I took Dennis's letter out of the drawer and read it one final time. Then I burned it in my kitchen sink, watching the paper curl and blacken, the ink running and disappearing. Not out of anger, but because I realized I didn't need to keep it anymore. Whether his apology was genuine or not didn't matter. What mattered was that I wasn't going to let his betrayal define my life or shape who I became. My parents are doing better now. They're not the same people they were before all this happened, but maybe that's okay. Maybe we're not supposed to stay the same after something like this. My dad is more cautious about who he trusts, more careful about sharing personal information, but he's also more present with our family. He volunteers at a financial literacy program downtown, helping people avoid the kind of manipulations we fell victim to. He says it helps him process what happened, turning his pain into something useful. My mom started therapy and joined a support group for victims of financial fraud. She says it helps to talk to people who understand what it feels like to have your entire foundation ripped away, to realize the ground you've been standing on was quicksand all along. She started painting again, something she gave up years ago. Her art is darker now, more abstract, but there's something powerful in it, something honest. As for me, I graduated last spring and got hired by a firm that specializes in fraud investigation. I help identify financial schemes, trace money through shell companies, and build cases against people who prey on others' trust. It's satisfying work, though sometimes I see patterns in the cases that remind me too much of Dennis's playbook. The way predators identify vulnerable targets, build trust slowly, then exploit that trust for maximum damage. The hardest part is accepting that you can never really know someone. You can spend years with them, decades even, trust them completely, let them into the most intimate parts of your life, and still be blind to what's happening beneath the surface. Dennis taught me that people are capable of astonishing cruelty, especially when they've convinced themselves their actions are justified. That the worst betrayals come from people we love, because they're the only ones close enough to truly destroy us. But my parents taught me something more important. That even after betrayal, even after watching your world collapse and everything you thought was solid turn to dust, you can rebuild. It won't look the same as before. The architecture will be different, the foundation stronger but also more cautious. You'll carry the scars, visible and invisible, but you can create something new, something honest and real. I still think about Dennis sometimes. When I'm lying awake at night, when I see someone who reminds me of him, when I work on a case that echoes his methods, I wonder what his life could have been if he'd chosen differently after my dad's mistake. If he'd confronted it honestly, gotten therapy, worked through the pain instead of weaponizing it into a decade-long revenge plot. He could have built a real life, with real relationships, with his daughter, maybe even remarried and found happiness. Instead, he built a hollow performance designed to destroy, and in the process destroyed himself. But he made his choice, and he lived with the consequences. 18 years in prison, dying alone at 58, estranged from his daughter, remembered not for anything good he'd ever done but for the methodical cruelty of his revenge. That's his legacy. Not the friend he pretended to be, but the monster he chose to become. My dad was right. Some betrayals run too deep to recover from fully. The wound closes, but the scar remains, a permanent reminder of what was lost. But the alternative to forgiveness isn't justice or revenge. It's becoming the very thing that hurt you, letting the poison spread until there's nothing left of who you were supposed to be, until you're just anger wrapped in human skin, hollowed out and filled with bile. I learned that lesson watching Dennis destroy himself in the process of trying to destroy us. I hope I never forget it. Because that's the real danger of betrayal, isn't it? Not what it does to you, but what you let it turn you into. Dennis spent 26 years planning his revenge, and in the end, the person he hurt most was himself. I'm 24 now. I have a job I love, friends I trust, and parents who are slowly healing. I've dated a few people, though I'll admit I'm more cautious than I used to be, more hesitant to let people in. My therapist says that's normal after what I experienced, that it takes time to rebuild trust after it's been shattered so completely. She says I'm making progress, that I'm not letting Dennis's ghost control my life, even if his shadow still lingers. Last weekend, I went back to my old neighborhood for the first time in years. I drove past our old house, the one we lost, and then got back before eventually selling. There's a young family living there now. Kids' bikes in the driveway, a trampoline in the backyard. I watched them for a moment through the window, a mom and dad and two kids having dinner together, laughing about something. Normal, uncomplicated, everything we used to be before Dennis. I didn't feel sad seeing it. I didn't feel angry. I just felt grateful that we survived, that we made it through to the other side, scarred but intact, that Dennis's revenge didn't accomplish what he wanted it to. He wanted to destroy us, to leave us broken and scattered. Instead, we're stronger, more careful, more wary, but stronger. That's the thing about betrayal. It either destroys you or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, if you survive it, you come out forged in fire. You learn who you really are when everything else is stripped away. You learn what matters and what doesn't. You learn that trust is precious precisely because it can be broken, that love is valuable precisely because it's vulnerable. Dennis never learned that. He never moved past his pain into something better. He just let it consume him year after year until there was nothing left but the hunger for revenge. And in the end, what did it get him? A prison cell, an early death, and a daughter who couldn't stand to be near him. I think about Sophie sometimes too, about how she lost her father just like I lost Uncle Dennis, except worse because he was actually her father. About how she had to watch him transform into someone unrecognizable, watch the man who raised her disappear into obsession and anger. We text occasionally, compare notes on our therapy sessions, share stories about learning to trust again. She told me recently that she's getting married. To a therapist she met at a conference, someone who understands trauma and healing. She said she almost didn't let herself fall in love because she was so scared of betrayal, so terrified of becoming her father. But she did it anyway. She took the risk, and she's happy. I refuse to let what he did define my life, she told me over the phone. He lost himself to anger. I'm not going to do the same thing. That's not honor. That's not justice. That's just more poison. I think she's right. I think that's the real victory over people like Dennis. Not revenge, not seeing them punished, though that helps. The real victory is refusing to become them, refusing to let their poison spread, choosing to trust again, to love again, to build again, even when it's terrifying, even when every instinct says to close off, to protect yourself, to never be vulnerable again. My mom said something similar last month. We were having dinner at their house, just the three of us, and the conversation turned to Dennis. It was the first time my dad had willingly talked about him in years. I forgive him, my dad said quietly. Not for him. He's gone, and it doesn't matter to him anymore. But for me, because I can't carry that anger around for the rest of my life. It's too heavy. My mom took his hand. I forgive him too. What he did was unforgivable. but I forgive him anyway, because that's the only way we move forward. I didn't say anything. I'm not sure I forgive him. I'm not sure I ever will. But I understand what they mean. Forgiveness isn't about the person who wronged you. It's about refusing to let them keep hurting you. It's about taking back control of your own emotions, your own life, your own future. Maybe someday I'll get there. Maybe someday I'll be able to think about Dennis without feeling that complicated mix of anger and sadness and confusion. Maybe someday I'll remember the good moments, the times before I knew the truth, without feeling like they're tainted. Maybe. But for now, I'm focusing on building my own life, my own career, my own relationships, my own future. I'm focusing on being someone Dennis failed to destroy, on being stronger, kinder, more honest than he could ever be, on proving that betrayal doesn't have to be fatal, that people can survive the worst and come out better on the other side. That's my revenge, if you want to call it that. Living well, loving fully, trusting carefully, but genuinely. Being everything Dennis wasn't and could never be. Not because I'm better than him, but because I chose differently. Because when faced with pain, I chose healing instead of revenge, growth instead of stagnation, life instead of death. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can do when someone tries to destroy us. Survive, rebuild, refuse to become them, choose light instead of darkness, even when the darkness feels easier, especially when the darkness feels easier. I don't know if this is a happy ending. I don't know if there are happy endings after betrayal this deep, but it's an ending, and it's ours. And we're still here. That counts for something. That counts for everything.